Thank you for coming. It's always an honor to be asked to speak to Taoseños about this town, which is, of course, my hometown and my central passion for like the last 30 or more years in terms of trying to understand this place, its history, its present, all of its complexity. And the more I learn, I guess it's kind of a cliche, the more I realize how little I actually know about this place. And it never ceases to astound me. Every time I come back for Fiesta, for example, I meet somebody or have those interestingly intense, intimate conversations that take place in the context of Fiesta. And I always meet someone that I didn't know existed or learn some story, whether it's true or not, that I'd never heard before. And so it's this endlessly unfolding revelation about this place where we live. I'm going to not stand up here and lecture. I'm going to sit over there where I can control the slides. It's really images that I'm going to show you and then talk to you about the history. There's so much about the Fiesta, which on the surface might seem like not much. You know, the Fiesta, the Taos Fiesta, I've noticed a lot of people who actually go to Fiesta a lot kind of put it down, but yet they're there. And they're these sort of standard critiques about Fiesta, which I'll touch on in my talk. And some of them are true, and some of them are not. And as I get deeper into it, then I realize, well, you know me, I thought this like 10 or 15 years ago, but now I'm not sure I was so right about that. Those of you who are old enough to remember know that the Fiesta was originally celebrated on the 29th of September in town, just the day before the feast day of San Jerónimo at Taos Pueblo. And that for many years was the Fiesta in Taos. And so I'm starting with images from that, the feast day. And really the idea was that merchants in town were constantly, in the early part of the 20th century or the latter part of the 19th century, trying to contrive ways to lure tourists to the plaza. And of course, the Pueblo was the big draw. And so how could they capitalize on the feast day, which drew so many people from around and various kinds of people to the Taos Pueblo? How could they siphon off some of that crowd and bring them to the plaza and get them to spend money? And so we start with San Jerónimo. And these are archival photos, and the dates are indistinct, or sort of indeterminate, but anyway, you all recognize this. This is San Jerónimo before the automobile. So it's been going on, and of course that's an ancient trade fair that has its own history. In fact, every one of these ingredients that I'm talking about, you could spend an entire afternoon talking about. They're all very deep topics. This seems to be a parade for San Jerónimo in town, probably in the 1930s. Something like this you will never see again on the streets of Taos. Well, who knows? Who knows? The other kind of antecedents, sort of the ritual sources on which the Fiesta draws, of course, is the tradition of Catholic procession, which is very rich and still very much alive in northern New Mexico, and which took place on the plaza and originates in the building that we'll soon see. Whoops. Wait. Okay, Catholic procession. Military parades. This again from around the turn of the century. UNM will have automobiles, or early in the 20th century. Also what you see with these photographs, and I'll show you also, is the changing face of the plaza. Which has been a constantly changing kind of thing. And there have been different distinct phases. A couple of years ago, there was a book on New Mexico plazas that came out, edited by Chris Wilson and a colleague of his, Poliades, who is a Greek architect. And there is a chapter in there that I wrote on the history of the Taos Plaza, which goes into its changing face and like also the secret of the tunnels and all these things that we hear about. Indian dances for tourists on the plaza. So these are all the sort of streams that converge with the invention of the Taos Summer Fiesta. Oh, and another is festivals on the plaza. This probably, maybe pre-automobile days, it's not clear. And it's almost not recognizable, but I'm pretty sure that's the Taos Plaza. this is a 1930 plat of the plaza. We had no images and no maps pre-American of Taos Plaza. We may think we know what it looked like. We may think we know when it was erected. We may know its history, but we don't, in fact. It starts with the Americans coming in. And so, as many of you historians know, the archival history of Taos has been destroyed virtually by various fires and other things. And so we don't have a lot of records about a lot of details of what was going on here before the mid-19th century. So anyway, it's still got the same configuration, pretty much. I want to call your attention to this plot here, which is the original site of the Taos Our Lady of Guadalupe Church. And this is where it all happens. This is the church through time. This was the first Guadalupe church, which burned and was replaced by the second one, which was built in 1911, and which was the church where I was baptized, and which I remember the day that it burned, which was around 1962. And I remember when that steeple fell, and I was about 11 or 12 years old, and up to that point, and I think those of you who've been here as long as I, or even longer, know it seems to Taoseños that nothing much ever changed until the 1960s. And then suddenly everything changed and kept changing quite radically. And to my 12-year-old mind, that was the most exciting and changing thing that I'd seen in my life, was the day the church burned. And that was a tremendously powerful episode in Taos history. It was then replaced a couple of years later, not in the same spot, but as you know, just north of it, on the off the northwest corner of the plaza, which is where, which still is the church of today. This is the plaza. This does not include the earliest photograph, which I'm sure many of you have seen, that's actually from probably around 1898, that has a white picket fence. But I'm starting here with early 20th century, and this is probably, well, this is pre-automobile, and you can see there's sort of a pole and wire fence and the mud. And the mud was famous. My mother's arrival narrative, she arrived in the 1930s, and one of the things she described about her first trip onto the plaza, where she arrived in probably around 1931, 1930, was that the mud was up to your knees. And I can remember actually the mud being up to my knees as I walked from our family house on Las Pasitas to school through the baseball field. And there were no sidewalks. The mud was incredible. This is probably, again, maybe the 19-teens, and there's this stone wall around the plaza and an old gazebo. And you can see there's no portals. This is not, the portal is is a contrived architectural form that was reintroduced, and Chris Wilson talks about that in his book, The Myth of Santa Fe, sort of the Pueblo revival style that gave both Taos and Santa Fe, and particularly Santa Fe, its sort of character as a tourist attraction. And so before that, there were these storefronts. And of course, the plaza is important because, first of all, the church is right next door. And it's this, throughout Latin America, and as well as the European antecedents, and certainly in Native America, there is this central area in a community which is the public space. And it's both a sacred space and a secular place, and it's the place where things happen. It's the heart of the community. And it's this square, this plaza next to the church, which makes possible the procession. And which really, for many years, up until the 1960s, the plaza was the heart of the city, of the town, of the village. It was where all the action was. It's where everything happened, and where everybody was. And now that's no longer the case. It's now famously a socially dead space, which the merchants are constantly trying to figure out, how can we revitalize this? And I just looked at the Taos News, I just glanced at it, and already you have this controversy. Will the farmers market, which is only temporary, right, will it hurt sales on the plaza, or will it enhance them? And there seems to be no agreement on that. The merchants seem to be afraid that somehow anything happening is going to detract. And I actually did interview merchants about 10 or 15 years ago to find out what does happen on the plaza during Fiesta. And given what the plaza now sells, it does not, unless you have a liquor license, Fiesta does not add to your commerce. It's famously a deterrent to commerce on the plaza, even though ironically it started out as a way to market what was on the plaza. So that change, this is the plaza that I remember, and that was the courthouse, which is of course the heartbeat in many ways. That's where all the action was, all the politics, all the gossip that generated out of the courthouse. And this was a gazebo that Mabel Dodge Lujan requested be included on the plaza that Spud Johnson, I don't know if anybody here remembers who he was, called Mabel's Privy. And this is now the replacement, the gazebo that we have today. This is the modern plaza, which was created in 1940, and I think a lot of what happens in Taos in many ways echoes Santa Fe. Our older, my friend Vicente Martinez, who you'll be hearing about here, says, well, you know, we're their poorer cousins. But we have in many ways imitated Santa Fe in terms of the fiestas, but also in terms of the look of the plaza. So this comes in, and this is the stone wall that many of you who grew up here will remember surrounded it. There's the gazebo or Mabel's Privy, and this is the modern plaza with Pueblo Revival architecture. This is the plaza in 1980, just on the cusp of tremendous change, when the last of the businesses that served the local community was still there. And these were really La Cocina restaurant, which had, some of you may recall, a very active bar scene. Taos has also always been a kind of alcoholic town. And you don't see that so much anymore because the cantinas and the bars are not on the plaza anymore. Now it's much less conspicuous, and from reading the paper a couple of weeks ago, I guess it's a big cocaine town too now. But anyway, La Cocina was a lively scene, but this was already by this time, most of the action, the social and the cultural and the political action had begun to move south of town with the moving of the courthouse, and now we have even a newer courthouse. But you can see, and I remember when they paved the plaza, and before that it was dirt, and you know, there was all that mud. And this is the plaza today on a normal day, which is actually a very empty space and a very socially dead space, which I think is a source of consternation to the merchants, and I think of deep sorrow and also profound nostalgia for the native people of Taos, for the Hispanic population particularly, who remember what it was. And I think that's part of the significance of Fiesta. And this is, I think, signals a new change that also I think is reflected in Fiesta, which was the erection of a statue to Padre Antonio Jose Martinez about, what, 5 or 6, around 2002, I think, on the plaza. Who has to be in secular clothing because this is a civic space and you can't have a religious figure dressed in religious gowns there. And I think that's a significant thing in a town where everything was named for Kit Carson, to finally have some recognition and acknowledgement of the significance of this really controversial and I think mysterious figure that we don't really understand very well, which is Padre Martinez. This is the first Fiesta Council, and this is around 1939, 1940. And I published a couple of articles, and I won't go into a lot of the text and the detail, but the merchants began to experiment with ways to bring people, tourists, to the plaza during the height of the summer season. And San Jeronimo was pretty good, but it really comes at the end of the season, or really after the season. And so they experimented with 4th of July festivals, various kinds of things to generate action on the plaza. And then contrived, there's of course this long-standing celebration of Santiago and Santa Ana on the 25th and 26th of July. And a tradition that maybe Doña Corina or others recall of women riding horses on the Dia de Santa Ana and men riding horses on Dia de Santiago. But one of the things I've noticed in the Taos news lately is they've started referring to Santa Ana and Santiago as the patron saints of Taos. That's not true. Our Lady of Guadalupe is the patron saint of Taos, and her day is December 12th. There's an interesting history about processions on that day that I won't go into that also was pretty controversial in its day at the start of the art colony. But anyway, these folks were the first to actually develop a corporate charter, which was explicitly for the purpose of promoting commercial activity on both San Jeronimo Day or the day before San Jeronimo, and on the 25th, on those 2 days of Santa Ana and Santiago, when the Pueblo traditionally celebrates with corn dances. So there were already people coming to view the corn dances at Taos Pueblo. And so Taos was sort of capitalizing on that. They developed a charter. That was their purpose, was to have festivities for that date. And if you look at who are these folks, I have it in this article, which I won't read right now, but it's like most of them were men and most of them were Anglo, and they were boosters. There were one or two Hispano or Nuevo Mexicanos on the council in the early days, but mostly it was really Anglo business people. And they were in place for about 10 or 15 years, and they really ran Fiesta and had fairly elaborate programs, which I'll show you. This is from 1940, which was, of course, the Cuarto Centennial of the Coronado Entrada into New Mexico. And there are a couple of things I want to call your attention to of those festivities. So this was actually in the summer, although, as I'll say, for the first, up until really 1960, San Geronimo was the big fiesta. The Santa Ana and Santiago were minor fiestas compared. That was the big show. But this was, you know, a big thing. And the 40s, as you'll see, really were a time of gearing up and generating all of these kinds of activities around the summer fiesta, as well as around the San Geronimo fiesta. A performance of Los Comanches at 2 p.m. On the 25th. And another was, what does that say? I have a reason for being that. Colorful, oh, I know. Wait. No. I have it on there for some, oh yes, colorful folk music. Another thing is a solemn, on that evening, a solemn vespers and procession at 7:30 on the first night. And then on the morning of the 26th, a field mass on the plaza by Father Quinn. I don't know if any of you remember Father Quinn. And so there was actually mass said on the plaza at that time. And then another thing that you don't see anymore in the programs is that they were still advertising as part of their program the corn dances at the Pueblo. The Cuarto Centennial Parade. This is the Calvary. This is Kearny's Entrada as the Americans occupy New Mexico, and New Mexico becomes incorporated into, after taking half of Mexico's territory, along with 50% of Mexico's territory, Taos, New Mexico becomes part of the United States. And this was partly designed by Blanche Grant, who wrote an interesting early history of Taos, and she wanted to have a complete reenactment of the American Entrada. So they ordered these costumes of the Calvary and had them right in on that. This is something you will never see today. And part of the story of Fiesta is how that came to be. Another thing you won't see, and this is supposedly from 1940, and these were like parades like the historical parade in Santa Fe that really showed the history in terms of like who came first. So the first people would be from the Pueblo, there would be the Indians, and then there'd be the conquistadores, and then there would be, so it was like this sequence of pageantry that reenacted the ethnic history of Taos, right, and the successive governmental regimes. This is a float that, I think that's Oscar Burninghouse there, I'm not sure, but it's the broken wheel float that reenacts the really the origin myth of the Taos Art Colony, which is the broken wheel episode, which I'm sure you've all heard. And so led by a Taos Indian. And this is something else I doubt you'd see today. This is Joseph Sharp himself in 1940. And notice it's San Geronimo here, riding in a horse and buggy as sort of like, the genitor of the art colony. Oops. Another 1940, the señoritas, and another thing people say, oh, well, people don't get dressed up for Fiesta anymore, and we used to wear all these, fancy Fiesta outfits, and, the famous skirt that nobody hardly wears anymore, and this is another episode, and there you get to see just a glimpse of Tio Vivo. Now, I'm in pretty much constant touch with Vicente Martinez, who many of you know, who was a dear friend and a fellow student of Taos history. And Vicente called me about a week ago, and I said, oh, I'm thinking of you, I'm working on this. And he said, well, he'd been going through his slides. He's having his slides put on CD, and he'd run across a bunch of slides that his father took in the 1940s that nobody's seen. And he sent them to me electronically, and so this is like the never before seen 11 color slides from the 1940s by Arturo Martinez and Salazar, courtesy of Vicente. And so I think these are fascinating because they really give us a window. I mean, these old photographs have so much information, and there isn't time to dwell on them, but there's just so much in there. Okay, and so here, a couple of things. There's, the long skirts. One thing that we never tire of here in New Mexico are conquistadores, and I think we don't think often about, how our Pueblo neighbors see that. I think there's a degree of insensitivity that's displayed by the pride we take in the conqueror image that we continually reenact and reenact and reenact, not thinking, what does this mean to the Pueblo and other indigenous peoples who suffered the arrival of them. But anyway, that continues to go on. Those have not gone out of style. And also the Spanish themes, the Spanish flag. And look at the crowd. This is typically a 1940s crowd, it seems to me. I'm not sure whether that's on the plaza. It could well be. But of course, the routes of the parades on the plaza have changed over the years. And there we have the trappers, who used to be part of, the early trappers. I guess now where you see that is in the hacienda, where they have the reenactment in the fall, and sort of people dress up as trappers and other early American figures here. And there you have the steeple, the steeple that fell. But you also see, like, the configuration remains the same. You've got the dirt, the dirt street, but the plaza is a lively center of all activity. And you have horsemen. I don't know if those are cowboys or they're supposed to be Spanish horsemen, but of course the equestrian theme also never goes out of style in parades. And here come the pioneers with, there's jeeps and the covered wagons reenacting against the sequence of arrival. And here they're exiting, and this is pretty blurry, but it's a Pueblo horse and wagon laden with flowers, and you see the men, which you don't see much anymore, with the braids and the blanket and the moccasins or the shoes with the soles cut off and the moccasin sole. So you don't see that anymore so much on the plaza, certainly. Certainly at the Pueblo you might see it, but it's not a common feature any longer in town. And that's another thing you don't see, the American cavalry riding out of the plaza. And this is an interesting one, no explanation, but it's labeled La Muerte, and this is probably the children's parade. And this is a child dragging, an older man, but a child riding with Doña Sebastiana, which is the icon of the Los Hermanos Benitentes. No explanation, but there it was. Something else you wouldn't see today. And there's the crowd, and these are the Comanches. And notice how young they are and also how different their costumes are than they are today. And people dressed up, sitting on that famous wall that we remember, and the grass, remember the grass in the plaza that all gets paved over and bricked over in the 1970s. A lot of the trees get cut down. There were 3 drugstores on the plaza at that time: Walgreens, the Rexall, and the Coronado. And a horseman, and these are possibly people in the Martinez family. Certainly she is. I think this may be one of his aunts, but sort of Dale Evans style here. And there's the La Fonda, and lots of beer signs in the old theater. And then look at the colors, all the colors of Spain. Not the colors of Mexico, the colors of Spain. And this is Cecilia, his sister, with Rosemary Packard. I don't know if any of you remember. And there's Tio Vivo, which at that time was still manually operated. I don't know if you remember the cranks. And before that, I think there were horses who did that. Again, a black and white, courtesy Pueblo riders, in Plains regalia. And there's the old Rexall riding on the plaza. And some of the parades go one direction, and some of the parades go another direction. No telling which of the fiestas this was. And this could be a children's parade, probably on North Pueblo Road. And notice again, the clothing that they're wearing. And this is something you don't see anymore either. Buying tamales are still there, but the cold beer is gone. And I think that the open container law really did change the face of Taos streets. And those of you will remember how different it was when people drank openly right all over the place. And you would step over drunks lying in the street. And there were places where people went to drink and party, and you don't see that anymore. Not that it's such a great thing, but it did change quite a lot when they started to clean Taos up for the tourists in a serious way. 1951, things are changing. Still they're advertising. Okay, one of the things is Fiestas of St. James and St. Anne. And I thought about, wow. And I think one of the stories of the Fiesta is, there are a couple of plot lines. One is, this is an event that is actually invented. It's created. That has become now understood as a deep, traditional, religious, and family tradition. All traditions get invented at some point or other. And it's like, why do they get invented and how do they change? But, and the thing, and it's a tradition that's invented by Anglo boosters that over the course of its 70 or 80-year history becomes totally Hispanicized, taken over entirely by Hispanic-speaking Nuevo Mexicanos. So today, I think there's not an Anglo on the council. Now and then there may be one or two. And the language, the public language of Fiesta has gone from English to Spanish. And it starts, the struggle starts in the late 40s when Felix Valdez writes a thing in the paper and says, why should the language of public discourse in our Fiesta be English when people here want to hear their own language? And it becomes an issue. And so now it's like, of course it's Spanglish, a lot of it now, but it's back and forth. I mean, you hear both English and Spanish. But St. James, and I thought, well, St. James, I mean, Santiago's big in Spain, and he's, and sort of, it's, Santiago Matamoros. I mean, this is the guy who, helps kill the Moors, right? And there's stories about him assisting also in fights against Indians. But St. James is also what, the Presbyterian, I mean, is the big Protestant. So there may have been that sort of element also, that there's a Protestant undertext here going on in St. John. So first of all, it's in English. The kangaroo court, which we don't see anymore. If men didn't wear beards, they got jailed and put in a cage, and they had to pay fines. People had to dress up. You had to wear a costume. They didn't penalize women, but they penalized men. So a lot of men used to grow beards for Fiesta. The Vespers, again, with achones, with torches. Again, they're still then advertising the corn dances. Again, there's a field mass on the plaza. That's Father Quinn in the 1950s, because I remember him, and it wasn't in the 40s. It was a different priest. Here on the plaza, again, the Santa Ana corn dance. So some things are starting to change. Jenny Vincent, of course, who's like, part of, no longer sings. I guess I filmed her a few years ago. It was maybe one of the last times she sang on the gazebo, but she's still an important part of Taos's musical history. So things are changing. You've got these lovely woodcuts. The Royal Court. This is that's you, Marion, isn't it? Yeah, part of the Royal Court. This is Cecilia. I can't remember the name of Cecilia Martinez. I don't remember. I don't know if Marion, you remember who the other princesa was? Martha Saavedra. Okay. And there they are, being with their mantillas and their, serenade in the parade on a buggy and horse. Now, this is something you surely would not see today. Today would be unthinkable. The 1950s, I don't have like a full set of photographs from every decade, but this is a window onto the changing face of Taos and social relations and ethnic relations and commerce in Taos. I think that's one of the things that so fascinates me about Fiesta. Some of you may remember that a standard element in the parade was Spud Johnson on a donkey as Padre Martinez. That would be unthinkable today. That would cause no end of offense and controversy. And there's Art Merrill. I don't know if you remember Art Merrill dressed up as a Mexican. So one of the things that you saw in the 50s and even into the 60s was white people dressing up as Indians, as Mexicans, and you wouldn't see that. You won't see the cavalry any longer. I think one of the things that you see in public displays that were so prominent up through into the 60s, that decade of tremendous turmoil and changing of ethnic and race relations in this country, was you don't any longer see American, the American Army of Kearney represented in any historical pageantry in New Mexico. And in fact, in this public pageantry, the presence of Anglos or white people vanishes. You don't really see them represented in the parades anymore, hardly at all, and they used to be really front and center. And I think that's pretty significant in many ways. Now people play themselves to the extent that they do. And so now, and that, I think that must be Mrs. Quinn rather than Regina Cook. It looks to me like Mrs. Quinn. But anyway, that's another thing you don't see. And this I just threw in because this is the Children's Parade, probably 1958, and that's me. Dressed as an artist with a little dog that broke my heart, and I won't go into that. And there's my father standing there watching in front of the drugstore, which he had for a number of years. And so it was a pet parade. I don't know if they call it a pet parade anymore. I know that there's a lot of people say, well, we have to get the parade going again. Eleanor and Fabi tried to revive the Children's Parade because if you blink, it's over. And it used to be a much more involved kind of elaborate thing than it is today. Okay, so here we are in 1968. A lot has been going on. But it's Santiago and Santa Ana now. And of course the 60s, and I don't have a lot of photographs from that era, and I don't know if any people do, but that would tell us a lot because that's when things really start to change, right? That's when the real estate thing begins to change. That's when gentrification first begins on the plaza, although it really gains momentum in the 70s and the 80s. It's the decade where the civil rights movement, of course, which begins earlier, begins to affect the Chicana movement, the Alianza, the land grant movement, the Native American movement, which goes into the 1970s, and it changes the face of race relations in Taos. And I think this is reflected in the plaza in many ways, or in the Fiesta. Okay, a couple of things. Before this, the Fiesta took place on the actual Saints' Days. Sometime in the 60s, they move it to a weekend because people are working. And there are people who say, well, this bastardizes it. It should be on the Saints' Day, and this is like just crass commercialism. And notice this year, it's not even close. This year, it's the 18th and the 19th, or the 19th in the middle of July rather than the third week of July. And one of the things I don't get into in this talk particularly is that I think one of the reasons that they've moved it earlier is not only to accommodate people who work on the weekends, but also because if you have it on that third weekend, what else is going on? Spanish Market in Santa Fe, which is a whole other thing. And that's like very well orchestrated, very tasteful. You have all this traditional Spanish, colonial art, and then they're always very ambiguous about the contemporary Chicano stuff. Should it really be on the plaza? Shouldn't it be on a side street? And then you come up here, and one of the things, of course, that begins to change in the 60s and the 70s is that the Pueblo retreats from any involvement, and Anglos stop coming. The themes in the early years are tri-ethnic harmony. And what happens in 1959 is that, and you can see why this has probably been building for a while with all the conquistador stuff and everything else, the town decides, and it's coming around again, the bypass issue. Where are we going to have a bypass to get through all this terrible traffic? And so the town decides that they're going to build a bypass sort of just north of Kit Carson Park that cuts just southwest of the Pueblo, so that if it's high enough, people can look over and see what's happening over there, and they don't bother to consult the Pueblo. And the Pueblo is outraged by this yet another act of, affront to their dignity, to their history, to their autonomy, to their input into the town. And so that year, they advertised the corn dances to draw people away from the plaza, and never again do they participate in any official way. Although now and then you'll see a Pueblo governor and stuff come if a mayor invites them. And the town of Taos ceases any longer to celebrate San Geronimo in town. And after that, the summer fiesta becomes the fiesta of Santiago and Santa Ana, the fiesta of the town. And the Pueblo continues contentedly and independently to celebrate San Geronimo on its own, and will have nothing to do any longer with what goes on in town, except now and then that will grace, and there are episodes that are always very revealing. So here you have it. It's now in the middle of the week. You have the coronation of the Queen on the courthouse, where it took place on the roof for many years. You have another thing that begins probably in the 60s, is these royal courts start visiting each other. I don't know, Marion, if that was the case when you were, they did even back then?
Yeah, we went to Santa Fe.
Okay, well I didn't know that. I thought it started later. But these royal courts from Española and Las Vegas and Santa Fe attend each other's fiestas. And it's like this royal presence, and they ride in floats, and they have these visitations. And also many of the royal courts now like go to hospitals, and they do these sort of civic services. And so to be a queen is like a really great honor, but also a great responsibility. And that's a really interesting aspect. And I could be wrong, but it seems to me it's in the 60s when the boomers start entering adolescence that the whole queen complex gets glamorized and beefed up, and they have a whole way of having to select the queen that isn't rigged, because there's a lot of cheating that goes on. And then, you know, who's going to be the queen, and what does it mean if your daughter is not the, you know, not the queen but the princesa? And there's some episodes of actual cheating that I've had people give me interviews about. And it just gets glamorized. And then it sort of reaches a peak, I think, in the late 60s or early 70s when the archbishop, the disgraced Archbishop Sanchez, the later disgraced, actually crowns the queen at Mass in the church. And I think there's this sort of, it becomes a bigger thing. So the de Vargas court is visiting here, but apparently they did it before, which I didn't know. Also, you begin to see Orlando Ortiz, Rudy Pacheco. By this time, Ernest Martinez, the guy who retrieves Tio Vivo from a corral in Peñasco, becomes sort of the MC. And Ernie was a very garrulous, easygoing guy who could go back and forth between English and Spanish. And because there were some people who thought, well, you know, it shouldn't be just one language, it should be both. Although I did interview Ernie many years later, and he said he learned Spanish, that he was not a native speaker of Spanish. He wasn't from here. Really interesting guy. And Los Charros, you have charros, and then again the corn dances are still being advertised, and then Francis Quintana. So you begin to have local leaders take over the public announcement, and who are fluent in Spanish, but also will speak in English. So it's changing. This takes us into the early 1970s. Another thing that happens when the 60s and the 70s, of course, what is it? 1968 is the great hippie invasion, right? Which is really a great turning point, I think, in Taos in terms of ethnic relations, when thousands of hippies descend on Taos over the course of 2 summers, outraging everyone, you know, smoking pot, taking LSD, fornicating on the banks of the Rio Pueblo, taking peyote, setting up communities everywhere, also getting gang raped, getting beaten, and having arson committed against them. And I think it's the first time since probably they scalped Bent that there's open aggression and violence against selected Anglos. And the business community looks the other way because they see them as a threat to their commercial. They think that the hippies are going to come in and run out all the tourists. And so there's even a year where they decide we're not going to have Fiesta because of the 3 Ds, dirt, drugs, and disease. And we're just not going to have, because the hippies are ruining everything. And so they held off, and then they had one at the last minute, again, just before San Jeronimo. And then after that. And then there were also people who were saying, well, shouldn't there be an Anglo queen? Shouldn't there be an Indian queen? And so they experiment with this for a while, but it doesn't really stick. And I think that the council, and I say this with all respect, because I think the council truly are the heroes of this, because these people work really hard, and we would have no Fiesta without them. But they devise ways to keep the queen Catholic and Hispanic and virginal without really appearing to be exclusive. And I think this continues to this day. Who becomes a queen and why, and what her expected comportment is a really interesting story, because she is the ideal of Hispanic virginal beauty. And I think that's a critical kind of thing. But anyway, another thing that happens is after the Alianza, after the land grant issue, is that the Brown Berets, the Chicano movement, comes to Taos, is very ambivalently regarded by the native Hispanic population, who do not have a tradition of in-your-face rudeness, and actually speaking openly about racism. Racism comes out of the closet, and it's in the air, and people are talking about it, and they're writing the newspaper about it, and it's out there. And there's also the ski industry has come in, and we have a hero of that early era here among us, and begins in serious ways to pollute the Rio Hondo. and also to grow without any control or constraints. And so there emerges in the 1960s, or late 1960s, early 70s, a committee to save the Rio Hondo that takes on Taos Ski Valley and its pollution of the river. And this really inaugurates or signals all kinds of protests that would have been unthinkable in the 1950s and certainly the 1940s. And this is a float that was that was a protest float to Kachina Village, which was, I guess, a big development, probably been outstripped many times up there by now, that was going to be built up there. And the downstream folks decided that, no, there's already a lot of pollution in this river that we still take water out of, not only for our fields and our cattle, but also there were people even in the late 1970s, 1980s, who still were drinking water out of the Rio Hondo. And so this was a protest, and Phaedra Greenwood could tell you the history of that because she was one of the proponents in that. But anyway, this is a float. And now you see floats. I mean, the La Serna Land Grant has had a float. We had a float years ago during the condo war in 1980 against the development of condominiums. So these protest floats, it's always been a political venue. Of course, the politicians always come. And they're sort of cultural venues that also are represented in the floats. But this is just one sort of example. Oop. That doesn't want to. We have to show that one. It's resisting the Phil Lovato's. Damn. I don't know why it's doing that. Okay, you get us. Okay, what that slide that refuses to stay shows is the program, I think it was in 1986, that was in commemoration of Phil Lovato, who was a mayor in Taos. What happens to the Fiesta Council is that after they stop celebrating San Geronimo and they stop filing annual reports for the corporation, they lose their charter. And yet people continue to organize the fiestas and operate without a charter for about 20 years. And it's the JCs for a while, and it's sort of like ad hoc. You know, JCs get worn out after a while, and this is, as you know, it's gradually Hispanicizing. It's left the Saints' days. You have Spanish and, the sort of, gradual banishment of a kind of symbolic Anglo-American presence in the pageantry. And it's sort of, people become exhausted because organizing Fiesta is is a big job. And you don't get paid for it. And the people who do it out of deep devotion. And Phil Lovato, as mayor, convenes a group of his friends and says, look, we've got to have a permanent organization that will take responsibility for the Fiesta. And out of that came the beginnings of the modern council. And that next slide that refuses to show itself shows that early Phil Lovato council. And some of them are still on, still on the council today. And so that's when it began. They got a new charter and they reorganize and they take this on. Saw that. And this is the council in the early 1990s. And this is many of the same people who were part of the Phil Lovato Council. That's Liz Peralta, Alfred Peralta, the Medinas, Teresa, Elma Torres, Martin Torres, and then Palemon and Neoma Martinez, and Rick Martinez, and Sally Martinez. Many of them gone now, but there's still some of them who were on the council, just a couple. And this is today's council, and it's bigger than this, but I've highlighted the long-standing members. And the most long-standing member is Elizabeth Peralta because she was on that original one, and she now has sort of an emeritus status. And I remember when I first started watching Fiesta really closely and being there at dawn and staying until they were cleaning up the last night and became a groupie of the council who were very gracious to me, that I had never seen anyone work so hard as Liz Peralta. during Fiesta, the way she was all over the place, you know, carrying things, organizing things, and I began to realize how hard they work. Don Francisco Trujillo was really the first person who actually sat down with me and gave me an interview. After a while, people were very forthcoming and very welcoming and very gracious and generous to me, but at first it took a little effort. But he sat right down with me and told me why he did it and what was it all about. And Manuel Medina, who's still on the council today, and Teresa, who now handles the booths. She's in charge of the booths, which she inherited from Palemon. Elma Vigil and Vanjie Romero, who inherited, and I call them the Queen Mothers, because and their predecessor in that was Liz Peralta, because these are the people who are in charge of the queens. They organize the pageantry, and they make sure that the queens travel, that the royal courts do their visitation and they do their civic duty, and they also watch the moral behavior and comportment of the queens. And if you're a queen and you slip up, they know it. And if the queen is seen drinking, or if the queen, she can't be married, if the queen slips up, she could lose her position. So there's this whole thing, and I think a lot of people don't realize that this is going on. And so they're now the Queen Mothers. And I just want to, there's Manuel and Teresa, that just last summer with the booths, and I think that's their son and daughter. This is Rick Martinez and Sally Martinez, both of whom are now gone. But it was Rick who I thought instituted a really important change. He was the guy who put the canopy over the plaza. Before that, we were right out in the sun. And one of the things you notice if you grow up in Taos is like when you're a kid, you spend your time, running around, and in my day, pea shooters and water guns and skirting in and out. If you're a teenager, you all go off and do what teenagers do, right? But once you hit 50, if you're still in the Fiesta, you get your little chair, your folding chair, and you go sit out there in front of the gazebo, and you sit there all day long, and then you go and da la vuelta, and you get yourself a Coke or something, or a hamburger, and you sit there and gossip, and you see people who you don't see any other time of year, and you also see a lot of people who have left Taos who come back. That's when a lot of the reunions are for the high school classes, and people come from California and all over, and they come for Fiesta. And so that's, I think, one of the profound things is this visitation that goes on. And now, thanks to Rick, we can do it in the shade or out of the rain, because it always rains for Fiesta. And now there's a new level of polish. I don't know if you noticed, I'd never seen an ad like that, like you had in the last Taos News for the Fiesta, where they have a website now, like a really cool website. That's where I got the Fiestas. I don't know why this is happening. This is not supposed to be happening.
There you go. You're back.
Okay, and this is last year's in front of Taos Mountain, the Royal Court. And those are all the full council, and you can go on the website and see who they are. So it's a new level of polish. I was very worried for a while in the 90s because I saw that the council, the one that I showed you from the early 90s, were really tired, and that they were working really hard and they didn't want to do it anymore, and they didn't know who to pass the torch to. Because now, if you're on the council, you have to ask someone, and you have to sponsor them, and they have to prove themselves. And show, and it's like this whole, it's just like, how do you know a queen? How do you pick a queen? One year I was asked to be on the Queen Selection Committee, and I was more nervous about that than I was about a doctoral PhD exam. Because I said, how am I going to know? How should I know what a queen? But I knew exactly. And it's one of these unspoken things. What's the quality that you're looking for? And it's the same thing with the council. What is the quality? And I thought, these people are, and everybody says, oh, they're too exclusive. They don't want a private club, but they work so hard. But it's like any group, in any village, on any acequia, in any academic department, any community, there's always what some people call the STPs, the same three people who always do all the work. Well, on the council, they have more than three, but it's not a casual thing. I mean, if you want to just do it for the glory, and wear the T-shirt, you can do it, but they really are looking for people who work and who have the right sensibility. And I would need someone else to tell me, to articulate what that sensibility is. But I thought, well, they're not going to pass the torch, and the wheels are going to come off the wagon, and there's not going to be Fiesta anymore. And I was all worried. It's gone. It's happened. You know, there's a new council, there's the old council, they're sitting on there, and they're doing it. And it goes on, and it's like, I'm not as close to this new council, I haven't really worked with them, and I don't know whether I will or not, to find out what the dynamics are. But it's a really interesting thing, and it's I can't emphasize the depth, the work that people do. Sometimes they have family tragedies, there's a death in the family, there's a terrible accident, they're still there, and they're working really hard. Watch them. How many of you go to Fiesta? Okay, pay some attention to what goes on with the council, and they really are hard, and they're unsung. And these folks maybe are beginning to sort of toot their own horn a little bit, which is good, because that earlier council were the most self-effacing people. I mean, you don't see them in photographs, you don't see them much in the Taos news, you don't see them up there saying, I'm the Fiesta council. They're working too hard behind the scenes. They're not in it for the glory. They're in it for some deep commitment to what people call is our culture and our tradition. Okay, this is the beginning. You rope off the plaza, right? You rope it off, creating sacred space. I don't mean religious space, but it's like, it's non-ordinary time and it's non-ordinary space. And that's the beginning. And it used to be 2 days, now it's 3 days, right? And it's creeping. So it's the only time that, you know, they really rope it off. I guess there are other times that they rope it off, but this is the only time that really is for the people of Taos. And so there's that. And another thing that, if you're a casual visitor to Fiesta, you might be aware of is what goes on at the church. And there is the Mass, the Mass the night before the beginning, and that's another thing that this last council did was they had these fairly expensive bultos carved out of cedar of Santiago and Santa Ana. She, of course, is the mother of the Virgin Mary. And another thing that I think has happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that they bring La Conquistadora from Santa Fe to the Mass, and she's often processed into the plaza at the procession. I think this is, of course, this isn't the real one. The real one was stolen and disappeared for years, and now they have a facsimile. And that's a whole story of who dresses her and what she wears. And this sometimes is on the Queen's float or the council float, but not always. And so La Conquistadora, who after Pueblo protests in the 1980s or 90s, got changed to Our Lady of Peace, because, you know, keep harping on this conquest. I mean, we've got the cavalry out. Why do we still have the conquistadores? Which is not a simple question. So this is the church. This is the priest, the current priest in his vestments. This is the crowning of the Queen. This is the audience. This is Ernesto Montoya. Sometimes the Knights of Columbus show up for the Mass, and you see them there. That's Francisco making announcements just as before they're about to go out, led by mariachis. And again, with so many of the kind of paraliturgical traditions around here, how they're carried out depends on the disposition of the priest. For many years, there was a priest here who refused to call it a procession, and who refused and said, you're not doing this on the saint's day, it's not real. This is just a commercial thing. And so for several years, they would have the Mass in Ranchos or at Holy Trinity and then drive into town. Now they have a sympathetic priest and they can have it back in their own church. And there you have the procession, you have the color guard, you have the mariachis. Another thing that's happened is that, as one of the council members said a few years ago, it used to be that we had to hire our mariachis, now we grow our own. And that's really Rick Branchal and his mariachi program at the high school. We now we produce our own mariachis, and there's a couple of generations of young Taoseños who are mariachis because of that program, and they often perform. And so here comes La Conquistadora, and that's the opening ceremony with the royal court and the whole thing. And sometimes somebody sings an entrega as they, the old queen passes to the new queen, although the crown is actually exchanged or put on the queen in the Mass now. And these are just, these are the queens. This is from a pageant. And they're not only Fiesta queens, they're also parish queens often have queens. And they also can ride in the parades and are part of this. So Nuestras Reinas, and of course then they go out in the streets and they, walk among the crowd and, are admired and photographed. And this is a list of the queens that was produced in the guide in the program a couple of years ago, and there's a long list, and there's some blank spots. But I've interviewed quite a lot of queens, and I said, and is it true, once a queen, always a queen? And I think there's a sense, that this is a tremendous honor. You are the face of Taos. You are, in some sense, the embodiment of Hispanic female beauty and proper comportment, conservative as that may be. And it always is with you. And also these young girls travel and they meet new people and they have to develop certain skills and certain graces. In the pageant there's a whole set of things that they have to do. They have to write an essay, they have to speak in Spanish or try. And so it's like, you know, there's certain standards that are operating there that are pretty interesting, I think.
Sylvia?
Yeah?
Was there any tradition of queens before 1900? I mean, is there any?
I don't know. Does anybody here know? Maybe Corina knows, I don't know. Parish queens, I don't know. Does anybody know?
It seems antithetical to the Spanish, you know.
What was the question?
How could you have queens when you were a territory of Spain?
I don't know. I mean, I don't know when the queens start.
Okay.
But I do know, and the only priest I ever who actually came out and said it was Father Bill, the Jesuit and the icon painter, who gave one of the masses one year. And I think it's an implicit connection. I think it's there in people's minds, although most people would say, oh no, they're not the same, we don't confuse them, is that, you know, we're talking about the Virgin Mary here. You know, and so that's the image. I mean, that's the model. Contradictory, anti-feminist, whatever, it's profound. And that's what's operating. So there's this implicit connection, I think, between the image of the Queen, dare I say the Corn Mother, and the Virgin Mary. Oh, and here's yet another kind of queen that you would not have seen on the streets of Taos until fairly recently, although it's a long-standing presence, an unwritten history of New Mexico and Taos. And this was Miss Taos, Miss Gay Pride, who was really proud and who looked great, I thought. And so she posed for that, and that's, of course, a transvestite, during Fiesta a couple of years ago. And I thought that's great. And there's Viborón, who's gone through a couple of incarnations. We used to have the Brujo and the Abuelo. They used to be stored in the basement of my father's drugstore. Then used to terrorize me when I'd go to the basement, which is, of course, sort of ties in with the tunnel mythology of Taos. But you still see that in the children's parade. And these are modern, these are the 90s. And again, the Spanish thing is very strong still, the galleons, the Spanish galleons. They had for a few years los gigantes, the giant heads from Pamplona, the ever popular conquistador, and also the frailes, the Franciscans, parading, are common themes. The Comanches now still a part of this. Francisco Gonzalez. That's a Pueblo casino float. You can't really see it very well. They do occasionally have a float, or the Pueblo, or usually the casino has a float. And then another thing that I think is in the last 25 years is the whole emergence of Aztecas. And so you have one of the things, the receding of these popular sort of symbolic images of Anglo-Americans sort of disappear from the public stage. And you have a proliferation of the sort of range of Hispanic, mestizo, Genízaro, Azteca identities that are represented symbolically. And that's, you know, and then the whole sort of change in the composition of the council and the themes of what Fiesta means. And so the Aztecas are always they always perform, and they're an important part of, it's like a new movement in a way. And, you know, these are just random shots. So you have Smokey. He's been a big part of it for many years. And there you have the unfortunate Diane Dennis, who wasn't elected. There you have the crowd, you know, lining up. And, of course, it no longer goes around the plaza. The route has changed over the years. It used to go past Kit Carson Park. Now it just goes up and then back to, you know, and starts at the courthouse. The lowrider, of course, is a new theme. There were, I say I'm running over time, so I won't keep going, but there was a lively exchange of letters in the 1970s or early 80s about lowriders and how filthy and awful the fiestas had become, and it got kind of, it was right out there in the paper. And then, of course, the entertainment, the music, mariachis. There's Lydia Solano, who I don't think comes anymore. She was tremendously popular, wonderful. Martin Torres used to be the program manager for the music, and he lined up really incredible people. They're still wonderful people, but they paid them, and sometimes now people volunteer. This is some folks from San Cristobal, and then all the young folkloristas. There was a whole rage a few years ago in the 90s, early 2000s of flamenco dancers. And now you don't see so much of that. But the folk dancing and then children dancing is a popular theme. And then Tio Vivo. This is 1986, and you may notice that it's different today. This is around the turn of the decade, they got a new canopy for it, and they painted the things. The story of that, as many of you know, and it's now become sort of, and they're the Lions who do it, who set it up. And it's really Wayne Rutherford, who's the real custodian and historian of Tio Vivo for the Lions. I'll get to the next slide. The history, now people are becoming self-conscious about the history of Tio Vivo. And this was, I think, in 2009, they had a poster that highlighted some of the points of Tio Vivo history. And that was Conquer. And then there was a cartoon. Ernie Martinez, who was the guy who the Lions sent to Peñasco in the late 30s or early 40s because some traveling carnival had left this carousel in a corral, and it was becoming decomposed. And he went and he bought it, I think, for like $90 or $99 and brought it back. And they had the artists paint the horses. And I think they refurbish the horses every now and then, and they still have the artists who paint the horses. And a few years ago, I worked with Wayne Rutherford. He wanted to get an oral history of Tio Vivo. And I put to you, and I don't know if you would agree or not, that Tio Vivo is the only thing in Taos that everybody loves. And that everybody agrees on. That this is wonderful, and that you wrote on it, and you want your kids to write on it. And I interviewed people, and they would go to tears. I wrote on it. I want my kids to write on it. It means so much to me. And of course, they use it in other venues now. The Smithsonian covets it. They want it. And we've had people from this sort of national or international carousel study group come and look at it and document it. And it has an interesting history, which I don't have to, even the pre-Peñasco history of it. And this, again, shows the connection with children. And this is one of Ernie's daughters, and Carmen, and her son, of course, who she wants to ride Tio Vivo. And I love this. Stephanie Valerio Rael, many years ago, made a model of Tio Vivo that actually rotates. And I talked to her and photographed her a few years ago, and she stood proudly by it. And that just shows that, the devotion that she has for that. And this is peak crowd, where you cannot walk across the plaza without body contact. And hookahs, I've interviewed, and I think it may be changing. There was a period where you would not see an Anglo on the streets for more than 15 minutes. And tourists, I was told by merchants, would ricochet off the plaza and go north of the plaza and stuff. This is not a tourist attraction. This is not intended by the council. I mean, they want everybody to come. They welcome everybody. But this is what, and this is the only time that the people of Taos who've lived here for generations come back to the plaza and reclaim it. And it becomes like their living room. And they sit there in their chairs, now me too, because I don't walk around anymore and stand in the sun. We sit there and we gossip and we visit and we eat and we exchange confidences and then we leave for another year, and we don't set foot there for another year, and then we come back. And I think that's also a profound thing. So there you have just people, standing, and then you see the faces. And I've tried for years to photograph the faces. And there's no way. You need a really good photographer and a really fine camera to capture the expressions on people's faces as they sit there in their once heart of their community and talk to each other and listen to Spanish being spoken and listen to Mexican